All right, here we are.
Yes, here we are. How's it going, Alessandro? I called you Orsini all my chunk of time I've known you.
I
And
know
now
that's
that there's two of you, it's kind of hard to say Alessandro. So you got to, it has to be Orsini.
it's kind of weird because like in Italy we call people by their last name. So when you call me Orsini, it was just like it triggers this idea that I'm back in school.
You know what? I understand. You know why? Because growing up in Haiti, same thing. People who know me, I could tell people who know me from my childhood because if I hear Duroseau, I immediately turn around and be like, who is it from my past is around here calling me? Only people from my past calls me by my last name. So I understand.
Exactly. Talking about past, we've been knowing each other for a very long time.
Yes, very long time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I have to thank you. I'm so happy that you picked me for this conversation. I think it was very very nice from you, but also the fact that we are, in a sense, linked by this thing that I was, basically your studio instructor in 2005 at NJIT, and I don't know, and we were both in, I guess, in two different phases of our life, but like interesting enough, we were on a path. A lot of things changed since then, right?
Yeah, a lot changed. A lot of good things.
A lot of good things, yeah. A
Yeah.
lot of good things. I, I guess we are more aware of a lot of things, but also more aware of ourselves.
Right. No, for sure. No, like thank you for saying yes and to agree with me. You are one of very, very few, and the one that remains in my life from that past, which was like, as you know, a very difficult past. But then, architecture is quite, the journey, right? To be
Yeah.
in, both as a student and you as like, a critic instructor, and to be in that space where the thing that linked us was like, how close we were in age and the things that we like, how we thought, you know, things we were thinking about, and staying in that space and finding friendship without even realizing that would ever happen, especially for me, right? You know, one, being in an institution where I didn't feel like I belong, and I won't go into that, but like, but to find someone that not only you could have conversations about things that you think is unusual, and to be accepted and be validated and be seen, and to have that person like, feed that for you to grow. For that, I say thank you.
Sorry for the car.
No, good.
No, I think I agree with you. I think that it was, well, for me, it was my first, teaching experience, but also, you felt you didn't belong in that environment for a set of reason, and I felt also I didn't belong for another set of reason. I was just freshly immigrated into the United States a year or so, and I totally believe that the role of architecture should have been something different that is not necessarily attached to this idea of the practicing and the making of a building. I thought there was a higher power of architecture that was related to people. And to me, being in that school, which is NJIT, we should say it, it's a school with an enormous potential of diversity of people. And but I think that the question of inequality and race attached to the practice of architecture became immediately apparent, I guess, to both of us. But at the same time, like I didn't have all the tools,
Right.
but and I was, I didn't graduate long before, like I was coming from Europe, and with all the baggage of Eurocentrism, that the pedagogical approach of architecture, a little bit all over, is bringing with it. And I realize, we talk about it. You remain. I guess we can bring up, this idea that me giving to you Invisible City of Italo Calvino, became like a sort of a turning point. And many years later, in the light of also what the process of healing from inequality in America is bringing up a lot of interesting question also related to those references. Calvino was somebody that was clearly aware of all these issues of inequality, and but he was also aware, he was an anti-fascist, but he was also aware of his Eurocentrism as a white man from Europe, and in a sense, his writing is, like, if we think about all the cities that his Marco Polo visits, there is no really mentioning of color.
No. I think there is no mention of color. I can't remember of a text that felt like, it was focusing on a very specific group of persons. It's almost like if you didn't know that based on the name to kind of like frame who the person is who's writing, there's something that is very interesting in terms of the abstractness, in terms of like, you're reading it, obviously, like, you're taking these poetry, sets of poems, writings, whatever they are for him, and sort of dissecting it. And to dissect it, at a younger age, not that young, but, younger age, and sort of like, as someone who is a huge fan of poetry and sort of like metaphors, and sort of like thinking in a way where you're thinking about architecture in a space where you're like, okay, it's not just problem solving. It's not just like, okay, here's problem, here's solution. You're here bringing the solution, but it's really, because to say, here's the problem, and then to design the solution, it's very easy to just look for one type of solution, right? And then, but what this does in some ways at that time, it really kind of like, forces you, where a lot of people weren't doing this, thinking about society, thinking about human beings, thinking about smaller groups of people and how they can inhabit. And I think one of the things where I feel like a lot of architecture failed, whether we want to call them out or not, is because they forgot about the main element, the human element. When you cease to sort of like, consistently wrap back to our society, the group of people that you're designing for, what happens, right? But then the other thing that becomes very important that people want to neglect is, it's not just people for people, which is beautiful about, like, invisible cities, where you're not really thinking about very specific group of people, but it does it in this very crafty way, which I remember the way in each piece, it sort of like gives you this framing. It also gives you a sense of, like, culture. Each different city sort of like presents, like, these cultures, they function a certain way, they move a certain way, they have this different flavor, they eat a certain way, they smell different things. So it's like there's an acceptance of the diversity in this way, which is so beautiful, where you can't not think about the things that people don't want to think about, especially in the space of architecture, where it's like, if I'm not designing specifically around food, can I think about food being another element that will be part of this, right? Because what is the role of food? First role of food is to nourish, right? But then there's the joy of food as well, that becomes a very important thing, where it's like, let's say you have, but then this is where I feel like a little bit of, and we kind of talked about this when we were talking about rest and and your possible future around conversations around that, where the difference between like, with money, class, rest is like broken down in different ways, right? You think about vacation, rest, and, like, leisure, and what that looks like. But it's the same thing too when it comes to food. The types of food that you ingest can be harmful to you, but yet it's cheap and available, where you get your food, all these different things. And then how does that tie to architecture? Sometimes you have to think about it. You have to think about the individuals and the group of people who will be in these areas. The fear that something like a Whole Foods, not to like name brand or whatever, being in the neighborhood automatically means that people has to be pushed out at this point, because it's just an indicator that a different group of people are coming in, is problematic. And that's around food.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think that there are many sort of reading of this, and one of the element of commoning to me is around nutrition, and healthy nutrition, and like I think that I remember a couple, maybe last semester or the semester before, I was analyzing with a group of students at Columbia, an area along Broadway, north of Columbia, where is a famous McDonald's. And I mean, the whole conversation was around accessibility to food and what kind of food you can access to. But at the same time is, the question of familiarity with food, what food becomes as nourishing the body, but also nourishing the soul, and like what relationship is established, or well, not only what relationship is established, but the question of how inequality remove that kind of nourishing from people. In particular, here we're talking about Harlem and African American, which is the predominant group of people there. So I see totally what you're saying, and I think in a sense, I agree with you. I think Calvino still managed to talk about beauty, death, lust, or and he does everything around this like marvelous architectural construction of these cities. But in reality, I'm questioning. Yes, he builds the conversation about inequality through culture. And I'm really, I was very fascinated about, our conversation um, um, that we had just over dinner. It was not a preparation on anything, but it was just more of a reconvening together, you and I. And when you talk about what is acceptance, or what is love, or the experience of it, and what is the process of healing that we are going through at the moment, or we would like to go through. I was very fascinated when you talk about something that not always is brought up so strongly, the fact that Black culture is not monolithic. Black people are not monolithic. And I think perhaps that's also the question of experiencing that. You made that example with food, and the experience of food, and the experience of leisure through food, or poisoning through food.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe experiencing and accepting the fact that Black culture is not monolithic is also another part of the process of healing that maybe we would like to hear more.
Right. Certainly. I'll say this for the record, since this is like an archival, conversation. Even what my opinions are is just my opinion as one Black individual, one Black female, big Black female who's Haitian, raised in Haiti, born in Chicago, but also partially raised in Newark as well. And I felt it's important to say all this because right there, look at my pattern, is born in Chicago by Black Haitian parents, and fled to Newark at a very young age with my mother, and at some point moving to the first time I went to Haiti was somewhere in 86 or so. This is roughly around the time where Baby Doc, anyone who knows the culture, Papa Doc, Baby Doc, is kind of slowly coming off of presidency or being pushed out and whatever. And sort of coming back here to the US, and then sort of back to Haiti again in 88, and being there during my formative years, but from time to time popping in and out in the US. And as a Black person, what you're doing, especially around those tender ages, you're absorbing a lot, and it becomes part of who you are. So not only are you're going from here, here, which for some people, it might feel like a lot. First of all, there's the fact that it's the reverse that's happening. Usually you leave Haiti to come here, you don't go to Haiti and whatever. But I wouldn't ask for it to be any other way, because it sort of gives you these perspectives that as I get older, and even now, I continue to reevaluate certain things that I lived and witnessed to understand, oh, that's what this is, that's what that is, not having the language for that. And why is that pertinent to talking about Blackness not being monolithic or whatever? But then there's these assumptions. I could only speak for myself, but anyone who is Black, who has been in situations where it's the assumption is already, if you're a woman, you're Black, there's so many things that are negative that get put onto you. the assumption of like, you know, what you might like, what you're into, what you're not into, what you eat and everything. But then it's those little things that builds up that becomes part of the issue. Um, as someone who has this trajectory, I can say it becomes a surprise to people if I say things like, you know, yeah, I listen to Slipknot. And then people will look at me like, you know, they're not believing me, like, you know, no, I listen to it, whatever. I enjoy some Slipknot. But all of this to say, it's like between language and the exposure to food and exposure to different types of people, also where you are, that's another thing too, where I happen to be at certain times in my life. I was also like, you know, around different types of Black people, even within Haiti. Like, you know, this is where, again, talk about you have to dismantle this sort of like idea of monolithicness, because you go to each one of these countries, and it's I don't understand why people want, if we, let's not go to Haiti first, let me just talk about America. There are different Black people from different places, so you got northerners and southerners, right? And then already right there's a difference of how these groups of people move. And then depending on like, you know, where they are from, there's like things that you're exposed to that is like so rich to that area that another group of people either don't know nothing about it or are deprived of it. What this does is like, oh, okay, I didn't know blank. So now this is an extra information in line that you can be aware of, even though you're not exposed to it. But this is where the stereotype becomes very dangerous, because the assumption is, oh, if you are from blank or if you are blank, then you should know this and know that. That's not necessarily true. And I think I understood that more growing up in Haiti with the different types of people I've come across from, like, you know, yeah, I lived in Port-au-Prince, which is like, you know, the capital. But when you are meeting people who are from Jacmel, people from like Leogan, people who are coming from Okap, the accent alone and the vocabulary, you realize, you're like, wait, what does this mean? And then they're like, oh, it means blank. And then they're like, oh, okay. And like, this is within the small little island. We know the size of Haiti, it's tiny. It's that intense and rich. And that's the word maybe we should talk about. It's the richness of the culture. It's the richness of Blackness, which is why understanding the language itself, Creole, and the richness of it in terms of the different languages that have influenced it to make it what it is, the richness in the food, in terms of they're a dish that are very specific to certain parts of Haiti, that unless you know someone who makes that dish to bring it over to your home, you might never know about it, basically. It's like things like that, that like, you know, I grew up with and sort of like is excited by that. That's why I could never sit around to assume that. And it was also very problematic where um, because I didn't fit certain criterias, I was then referred to as being bootleg, as a bootleg Haitian, because I wasn't born there. And like, you know, meanwhile, I speak the language. I speak Creole very well. Like, you know, I speak Creole probably better than I do French, unfortunately. But that has more to do with the fact that I don't practice nearly as much with people, you know. And then even like I grew up uh, um, learning to speak Spanish, French, Creole as well. And then there was a moment where I didn't remember English at all. Meanwhile, I was born here and I spoke the language because I was so invested in where I was, and I'm not speaking the language all the time. So I could understand it, but then there's my hesitation to speak it, and was like sort of like, you know, very shy about that and embarrassed by it. And it's kind of happening now again with French. Whenever people ask me, oh, do you speak French? And I'm like, I'm not gonna go there or whatever. I could still read it and sort of understand it. You know, like there are people who are great linguistically and they could just jump into it. With me, it takes some momentum. So I bring this all up in a very personal level to say that all the things, the intricacies of us as human beings and our exposure to things is the reason why people need to stop looking at any group of persons so monolithically and problematic, because that's why the pieces in the show, in some ways, while it might talk about communities, it might be cityscapes kind of like idea, but they could also speak on an individual level and the complexities of an individual, because of the fact that if there are people who are born, raised, and like their family are born, raised in certain areas in city, they never leave. They are like, you know, through and through, like, you know, the roots of these areas. And that's amazing. That's a beautiful thing. And there are people who, like, you know, are like a little bit peppered with so many exposure of things, and it's part of who they are as well as Black individuals. It doesn't discount that or remove it.
No, I totally agree with you. And you know, through the years, I mean, I've been in the United States for a very long time, and being very close to a lot of friends of mine, which happen to be African American, and I have also an African American partner, and this, I mean, it's interesting because all this goes back to this idea of the kitchen, and like, you know, I think is extremely fascinating. Also, you know, this like sort of idea that, you know, also, you know, the African American cooking is like also monolithic, thinking about the black eyed peas or the, you know, the traditional comfort food, but it's actually absolutely not. I'm learning that, you know, within each family, there are contamination of other recipes because of the different culture from which they're coming from. And this is incredibly linked to Blackness, because Blackness is not defined as, you know, only purely as, you know, the color, but these are like different cultures that are together. What does it mean to, you know, to be Black? And I think it reminds me the project of Jermaine Barnes for the Black Reconstruction exhibition at the MoMA that closed in May. And, you know, part of his show was revolving around the idea of the kitchen in the traditional African American house. And you know, one of the pieces in the exhibition is this gigantic spice rack with all the spice that you can possibly use. And I think it is that's beauty. That's the beauty of you know, experiencing and Blackness. And I think that if, you know, if people would just, you know, pay attention to it, you know, you will vibrate in a different way. You will feel those vibrations. You will feel those differences. And I, you know, I totally, you know, agree also with your experience of language, which I totally understand. Being an immigrant here, you know, English was not my first language. Still, it is not, but it's much better since 2005.
You sound great. You sound great.
But yeah, I mean, like I think it's a very deep thing. And also, I mean, like going back to what you said about like what we are saying here are each own respective opinions, which is true. It's absolutely true. But I think I will go beyond and you know, just, you know, I'm just gonna attach to, you know, to the original Rap on Rise of James Baldwin and Margaret Mead, because you know, that was a remarkable, you know, public conversation. It was just like feeding each other different things in intellect and imagination. And, you know, one of the reasons why I was very happy to do this is because I think we are feeding each other our own intellect. And I think from this kind of discussion, you know, could really, you know, that idea of healing could actually materialize the acceptance of the diversity, the experience of diversity, and in a sense, making this diversity, you know, the everyday experience of, in a sense, I mean, like it really, the more you think about it, you know, the more it really relates to our perception of the other. We really think of the other as this monolithic entity that is composed only of one ingredient, which is never the case. It's really not what we are. And I don't know, I think this conversation are really beautiful. So I rather think that instead of our own opinion, we are just really doing this like interpolation of right. Intellect and inspiration, and you know, to feed our own imagination, and then, you know, the outcome will be another thing, another project. You know, yeah, you're starting a new chapter in your life, but I think every time we finish a project is a new chapter, and it is somehow, I don't know if it happens to you, but every time that I finish a project, I see things clearer. I have this capability to say, okay, this is exactly what we should have not done, and, you know, I move on into the next sort of endeavor with, you know, fresher look, which I think, you know, this conversation will be inspiring something tomorrow. You know, right. You were citing the conversation we had about leisure. I'm writing about the relationship between leisure and space, which is incredibly problematic. I mean, like, it's, you know, leisure is linked to the idea of the leisure class, and how capitalism framed the idea of going on vacation, and I think that's the first, you know, problematic sort of construct of leisure. And also, you know, my discovery, I mean, like the discovery that, you know, one of the early sort of conceiving vacationing is linked to slavery, because the slave master was basically wanted to control the free time of the slave, and sort of in a sense to possibly regain interest to perform again the same task. And so I remember we talk about the fact that, you know, the beginning consisted even to get the slave drunk in a way that it was so poisoned by alcohol that the only thing that they wanted to do is, you know, go back to perform more work for the slave master. I think that this you know, disturbing construct, I think they are still around us. And, you know, who can go on vacation, and, you know, right. who can afford to really be free from our really production of labor. And to that particular, you know, question, I already told you, I went to visit the show at the Artist Alliance, which is an incredibly powerful show. And then, you know, I guess that talking to you, it came out that it's not casual, the white canvas of the gallery. I think that after you told me that, after knowing that the show was produced in the gallery, linking indelibly the production of the architectural object and the production of the art piece, I think it's very profound. It's the invisible work that the architectural worker it gets invisible almost, but then it materializes in the building, and the invisible work that you produce, the labor that will never get noticed, to produce the artwork and the layering system and the details and the countless hours of understanding the relationships. And I think I still, I think it's so powerful, the fact that deliberately you have left the white wall behind. And I think, to me, like, my reading of the pieces in the show, they immediately become these surfaces, black surfaces with different intensity, different textures, different nuances of blackness. And here we go back to this idea of, monolith. Your work indeed is not monolith. There is this like layering that is just really incredibly poetic. But to me, really, they become a threshold. It's a threshold between the observer and the white wall behind, linking forever these two worlds. That it's also kind of funny, because everybody talks about the white box gallery, like and well, I think that in your show is incredibly powerful. The relationship is not at all the white box.
Right. No, it's not. It's that was always an intention when the series has been in the works. To go back a little bit, you talk about when you end a project. I have a lot of open-ended project, and that's on purpose. Because I feel like as human beings, we're evolving till the very end. And if you're lucky to be a legend, whatever that means, or your legacy lives on, I feel like, there's some level of morphed aspect, like, pray that is positive. You think about Baldwin, that still kind of exists with us, And to me, these ideas of like completion, because that's a societal thing to like, it's very corporate for me. Like, we've got to complete this, we got to have it, deadline. And I'm like, I'm still living, I'm still developing this idea that I might have right now. I feel like to see what it looks like 10 years from now, as I continue to do it, will be very interesting as an element. That said, this very particular series, Black on Black with Black, I've been working on it for a very long time, and it was a struggle because it was like partly economical, trying to understand, how do I make this work when you're not working, and when you are like, I was working but I wasn't getting paid for a very long time. And then what I was getting paid was like pennies, basically. And even when I started to get paid, sometimes my whole paycheck would go into just getting like, materials, fibers, and sort of like putting it to the side. Literally, it was like buying it and putting it to the side, and waiting, because it still couldn't get done yet. And I've done different variations around this, and I felt like I thought I had a breakthrough when I was in fellowship at AIR Gallery in Dumbo. when they gave me a fellowship there, and I was really grateful for it. Part of that exhibition, there was like 4 panels where it was doing the same thing, but in a much quieter way, where it was like, these white frame, thin frame. That I was very specific about that because this is going back to the architectural sort of like, apprenticeship, where you're very aware of everything. Your first day of studio, no matter what studio you're in, basically you get introduced to your problem, and then you have to figure out your solution. By the next class, which is in a day or two, you have to already have sketches, diagrams, ideas, elevation sections or whatever. So the process in architecture to always be aware of your moves, and sort of like being, not only you had to be aware of it, the intentions behind it. So this made that, in some ways, a lot of times I get caught up in those details in my work, as going back to that invisible labor, because you're researching, you're thinking, and you're processing all these things. So being very aware that I needed thin white frames, because I needed to create this sort of like, imprisonment. What is racism? What is white supremacy? What is this? What is that in the reality that we live in? Meanwhile, using the different Black materials, that is a representation, or can be seen abstractly as like, the different Black cultures from different areas, different diasporas or whatever, and sort of like, showing, yes, instead of seeing separation, but seeing the similarities, but then the differences. So differences is a positive thing here, right? You might speak Spanish, you might speak whatever, patois, you might speak Creole. We all can coexist, but as we're coexisting in this reality, we have to be aware that we're still living in a very colonial society, a racist society. How do we make this work? But then there was a moment where I wanted to go a little bit larger, where it's like, what if there are moments where I didn't want to use the white frame? Because the white frame, while it was there, you could see it, right? So then you can question the white frame. But because I'm also constantly talking about these problems becoming white noise to many people in our society, right? Because at some point they forget about it. Some people it's out of sight, out of mind. Some people they choose to like, ignore it. And then being aware of all these sort of like, mechanisms of how people move within our society, and how easily certain people could be disposed of or not thought about, or these issues, I wanted to sort of like eliminate the frame, because making it thin was somewhat of that step. But then to completely eliminate it, how does that look? The first time I did it, I felt like the piece itself was a little bit too big. So thinking about scale really became this other very important element as well with this. So this meant that the gallery wall was very important at some point, and whether the gallery wall, and that was only um kind of like, as like I've shown the work slightly differently over time. Again, it evolved. But then being in residency at Artists Alliance, and sort of like starting to work on it and looking at the materials, and I was like, this is it. It was like the breakthrough of like, oh shit. So your breakthrough comes in the end. My breakthrough starts in the beginning of this, where it's like the breakthrough of like, oh, this is the direction I need to go into, to sort of like really develop this conversation, this sort of like language, or whatever I'm trying to create, because it's surely not one thing. So the gallery walls in some ways, and yes, there's that whole conversation, the white cube and all that stuff. But then I'm like, no, I gotta use the white cube. And the white cube is gonna be the silent kind of, I don't want to say silent but deadly, but like, you know, it really does become this thing where you do want to forget about it. And I want people to forget about it. And I want certain people to be aware of the role of the gallery walls in very specifically with this piece, because it becomes this, I don't want to say dangerous, but it does become the thing where you could easily forget about it. And that is what it needs to do. It plays a very pivotal role to the work itself. And depending on different spaces, when this work continues to develop, praying that I'm allowed to develop it, that, like, you know, it can be that thing where it's like, you know, the different spaces. And I remember the first time around, especially when I had it in the white frame, it was suggested to me by a number of people because all the work was Black, and I was talking about Black on Black with Black. A lot of people were concerned about the fact that this was a little too much to have this in a white space. Can we make the walls Black instead? I said no. I didn't even hesitate, because it becomes too easy, because clearly they felt the discomfort that needed to be felt. So I was like, I'm doing my job.
Yeah, no, totally. That's discomfort. That's like, can you please make it disappear? But I
Yes.
think, yeah, and it's just no, I think that's very powerful, and in a sense, you know, the appropriation of the gallery wall, I think it's really part of this pivotal moment in that show. And also because I mean, there is this association, like among people, but also distracted gallery goers. And I'm talking about the whole phenomena of going to art opening and so on, and you go to the gallery such and such, whether it's more famous or less famous. And there is always this idea that the gallery is a simple container that is not really contextualized to the art piece, except in like maybe few cases in which the artist. But I think this is a little bit different. I think this was like not only deliberate, but acknowledging like the white wall is just slapping you back, because it makes the discomfort of the piece really apparent. And I think it's very interesting. And like you said something, when a work is completed, the idea of completion is not only corporate, but it's just really part of the white supremacy narrative that is embedded into, the idea that completion means I complete my work, but I am complete because I abide to a specific narrative. And the narrative of white supremacy is, the idea of the white family, the patriarchal white American family that is translated into this sort of a religious institution because of the way is framed, the way women are framed within the white patriarchal family. And there is, this appropriation of things through that narrative, which also, invades other pieces of our, everyday life, including our spaces, the houses, and, how the whole idea of the inequality that is linked to the space that we inhabit, and the white flight that refuse to stay in the urban environment with a high percentage of African American people, and then constructing all these like ideal suburban places that would correspond to that idea of purity, an idea of purity in which that richness that we were talking about before of the people and everyday life doesn't get consumed. Like the idea that in those houses, the most common act of human being, like sex, doesn't get consumed. It doesn't get consumed. It's not being seen. It's hidden, and because it's part of those things that you don't show. And I was in a conversation with a friend of mine because the origin of this idea of this idea that babies are not supposed to sleep with parents comes from this. It comes from this like segregation of the white American families, in which kids, even like very, very small, like just born kids, are not supposed to be in the room with the parents because it's not pure enough. And from there, some doctors theorize that they can get killed by their parents. And I'm pretty sure that maybe, maybe some accident happened, but like it's a construct. It's a construct of the white family that, you're not supposed to be seen. And so we are removing the whole, idea of diversity and richness in the life of this.
I mean, even within the space of sex, it's kind of hard. Like I can't. I don't know. Like as someone who believes in more conversation needs to happen around sex. Like the fact that till this day, a majority of people, or like there's a lot of people, I don't know if it's a majority or not, still thinks like, any conversation around sex is taboo. Meanwhile, there's a lot of things in media that's like very sex oriented, but in what capacity is sex even being brought up, as you're saying, like, there's like these different sort of framing around like, intimacy and sex and whatever, being sexualized, who's sexualized and whatever. It becomes like, a very hard conversation. And even you bringing up this aspect of family and like, an offspring or child being born, I think is very interesting because I have been part of like, the many researches that are ongoing right now and works that I'm doing and like, developing is like, Black on Black eroticism in terms of like, more like, this, like, I don't want to say, it's more like the response to how media is framing Black intimacy and Black love and sort of like, even the fact that a lot of people do not seem to like, find attraction in Black women unless, you are a certain type of Black women. And even then, like those numbers are very low. That said, I came across something that till this day is bugging me because I'm still trying to find the reference. I remember jumping from bookstore to bookstore, looking through so many books. And I remember reading a passage where they were comparing queer intimacy versus hetero intimacy and how they framed it that hetero, like, intimacy, sex is only for reproduction. It's only to procreate. Meanwhile, for queer people, it's only for pleasure. So to go back to this space, and I'm not sure who even like, said this, and I really want to like, find that reference. I know I didn't make it up, but I think based on what you're saying, it goes back to these rules that people have made based on some other things. It's on some level, especially with all the light of like, the Cosby situation and all these like, pedophiles out there, whatever. Now we have like to worry about the home where loving your own. You have to worry about that. It becomes so poisonously complex because it's like something that is normal been uh, 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 um has been like poisoned in such a weird way between rape and sexual molestation and like all these perversion around it, but then there's a beauty to it, and it seems like people are less talking about the beauty, and they're trying to these days, and more focusing on the negativity. So the separation of your child that you just had that can, like, you could put I've seen plenty of parents growing up in Haiti where the baby's like a month or two old, and in between them the baby didn't suffocate. And if you are not in that awareness, it's like what you're saying, it's like, if you're not in that awareness that you have another being between you that actually needs your protection, they need your warmth because they need to, like, feel that love. But at the same time, you have to be in that awareness in your body as well, that not only do they need you, that they're present and that you can't roll over on them, right? And if you feel like that you don't have that capacity, then instead of removing them altogether from the room, maybe they can be in the room.
In the room, yeah.
Yes. So, but this is going back to a lot of aspects where even this is where I feel like we can't talk about, especially how I move in my practice, everything gets very tangled, like, going back to kitchen references, like a gumbo or bouillon or whatever, like, you have like, your meats and your vegetables and your this and your that all together get stewed up. And there's this rich flavor that happens. And it's the same thing. You look at any of these things, you're talking about a space where there is love and intimacy, but then a new life that comes into it that needs a different kind of love from these individuals within the same space. This is talking about architecture. This is talking about psychology. This is talking about love. This is talking about different elements of intimacy. All of it and more sort of presents itself in this very specific space that was designed by someone that no one even knows and think about. So I think these are the things that, like, I think about a lot. I kind of dissect things like that. The, like, the fact that you may design a space and then you don't know who's going to be living in it, like, for generations to come and whatever. Or the fact that, you could walk into a space, I walk into a space, I think about the thickness of the wall and what might be behind the wall, whatever, versus someone who's not even thinking about that. The first thing they're like, oh, where I'm gonna put this, I want to knock this wall down and, paint this or whatever. It's like different mindsets, then you approach this thing, right? And then, to think about that from a societal point of view, going back to, like, I think you kind of brought this up a little bit, this idea of like gentrification, be it in Harlem or Brooklyn or whatever, there's a little bit of that's happening where it's like there's a disregard for the culture that was there, right? And it's like, okay, they're not looking at what's behind the walls. They're not looking at the structure when they walk into the room, the fenestration, although architecture is not about doors and windows. But we can't but help but think about all these elements in terms of like how you move into a space and what is underneath the floorboard, what's in the walls, right? Because these are the things that I see to be these sort of like, things that are very similar in a lot of neighborhoods and areas that would be synonymous to, like, you know, cultures that have been around for ages, and they have these, and then the people who've been like getting older there, those who didn't have any kids versus those who have kids, who are teaching them the language and parts of the culture versus those who decide not to teach them about those things. And then you have this other, I don't want to call it force, but this other thing, like the white gallery wall that comes erect itself in these spaces and slowly sort of, like, you know, opens up in a way where it's like, take this wall down, take this down, and then slowly you're seeing this thing that's falling apart. How do you rebuild that? Can that be rebuilt?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a couple of things that are, you know, very interesting to me, and also it brought me to my mind, you know, this, for example, this idea of like designing for a person that, well, first of all, architects for very, very long time consider themselves unaccountable for whatever they do and whatever they drop on people, and that's, to me, something that I've been, you know, bringing up in the profession for a very long time, but I wasn't really, you know, believed or listened until more recently, because the question at stake are, you know, finally, you know, in front of our face. And a couple of days ago, I went on another rant of mine on Instagram against BIM system, building information modelings, through which normally corporate office uses to design buildings these days. And the BIM systems, it's basically based on libraries or architectural component that you can download and you can plug into your model, and then, you know, together with that, you'll download a series of information for construction. So you basically you know, eliminate a lot of problem of translating the design intention into a construction document. But the result, well, first of all, I mean, this is, you know, again, another idea of capitalism, which is basically telling you architecture is nothing but a way to distribute space in a utilitarian way that is efficient from the point of view of the distribution of the space, the distribution of the material in which you can build something, but is especially efficient in the way it is designed, because it basically, the BIM system is like making everything even more efficient, you know, and is conducive of this like very problematic relationship between the production of labor of who is designing the building and the production of labor of who is building the actual architectural, you know, sort of object. But the problem is that all these projects are neutral boxes. So in my and hence these are perfect machine for gentrification. Like there is a very deliberate idea why it is a very, you know, standardized layout, standardized facade, standardized windows. There is no like, you know, it's old decoration, and like, you know, even the ones that they look a little, let's call them different, it's because it's deliberately wanted that way. You just like embellish something. And you know, it's funny because it comes into my mind what you told me the other night, that you said, I've been rethinking Adolf Loos Ornament and Crime. But yeah, with all the consequences of modernism, that, you know, really modernism perpetuated into the discipline a number of inequalities and ideas that went on to construct what is the whiteness of the architectural discipline. But going back to the design of these spaces, they are neutral boxes. Why? Because they have to appeal to anyone that can possibly move there. There is no idea of who is going to inhabit those spaces, what kind of rich life they will produce there. It does not really matter. The most important thing is that they are efficient and they are white. There's no decoration, because no one can say, oh, well, I don't like that red color and I don't want that. And so that's really, a very corporate vision. So one of my attack was like, the post was basically depicting the railing system of the second floor in Paul Rudolph Halston townhouse. Okay. And there is basically the very famous one of the early and talking about the monolithic idea of blackness. There is Sterling St. Jacques, which is considered one of the first Black model in high fashion, which has a number of different origins. Like he's, coming from a very specific background, and so he and Pat Cleveland are dancing on the rail, and there is no such like this idea of efficiency removed everything from the production of the space, because today with BIM I can just download a railing system that totally works. It has also embedded the information for construction, or even to go further, or to to where to buy certain components to build that. And I think that is, really the removal of, the different way in which we live our life. And furthermore, I think it's really the removal of the diversity. Like those spaces are made only for a certain type of people. And at least in their specific intention. And I always question, like, me, as well, forget about it that I'm an architect, but like, you were born in Chicago, but raised in Haiti and then in Newark. Like, if you have to design a space for a very, and here site specificity, I mean, I will not call it site specificity. I think you really need to look into the human beings that they are going to inhabit the spaces.
And I have gotten in trouble for that shit.
Yeah.
I have gotten so much in trouble for that shit. Dominique, that is not how architecture is done. For years, many architects have done it a very specific way, and they've done it well. You're just causing problems, da, 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 da. And I'm like, how are we designing for people that we've never met? What are their needs? I don't know what their needs are. So it's like, first and foremost, there's this removal of the person. So already there's this sort of like going to what you're saying, like these very like, plainness, that plain white box. But I feel like the plain white box is the contemporary thing of that, because early on, before I've even stepped foot at NJIT, coming from Haiti and not having any mentors or anyone to guide me into understanding what architecture was, what I needed to do to prepare, all this stuff or whatever, I was trying to figure it out on my own. And this is the first time I'm saying this out loud, and it's gonna be like, recorded and be living online for life. I used to buy, you ready for this? Those weird magazines that would have those fake Victorian, show you the floor plans, all the stuff to get done. Like if you go to Home Depot back in the days, like, you know, in the late 90s or whatever, they used to have them all over the place, right?
Of course,
And
yeah.
there was the do-it-yourself houses, there was the do-it-yourself plumbing. That was my first sort of like, you know, architectural, like, you know, entry basically to teach myself, because I was like, I didn't know Frank Lloyd Wright yet. I didn't. This was my first sort of entry and trying to look at them and trying to understand them, but it was quickly becoming like very repetitive. And I'm like, who are they designing these things for? You know,
Yeah, but
what is
that's
the
you know,
goal?
that's the inception of American suburbia. You know,
Right.
Sears used to sell houses on a catalog.
Exactly. And that stayed for a while until you have this sort of like system that was slowly being built. And it goes back to this like design for efficiency, but for who? You know, who is it efficient for, right? Because even the people who have money who can really afford those spaces that these white plain block boxes that they're designing, it really isn't for people like us. Not anyone who's like here right now. It really is for a very specific, like, you know, group of people. And then we come and we know the business, we know it very well. My ex-partner, all the time he would tell me, okay, we're working on a new project, da, da, da. And I'm like, wait, didn't you say this place just got like, you know, rebuilt, retrofitted or whatever? And then he's like, yeah, someone just bought 2 floors. They're like merging the 2 floors. I was like, okay. And then I'm like, so what are you gonna do with all the stuff that's in there? It's like, we're gonna get rid of them. They don't want them. It's like, now we're talking about architectural waste, right?
Mm-hmm.
Layers to this, right? And it's for someone who, I don't want to say I'm without, but there's so much problems there, because it's like the people who wanted the space, who can't afford it, didn't even want this thing. So it was like they put things up for show that then gets to get ripped out again. It's like this doubling of like ripping away to make way to also prove, based on what we're seeing, that really architecture is an individual need and base thing, but it doesn't get designed in that way. So you have a lot of waste that happens like that. There's a lot of erasure that's happening in that way. You know, there's a lack of respect for the history in certain spaces. It's like, if you're coming into a space that has a rich history, what is your role? Because I can't walk into a space and I know, like, it's like going into a, like, you know, why am I blanking on his name? Architect who makes the colorful, Mexican architect who does super colorful, like, you know, architecture. He's famous for his architecture for horses.
Barragan.
Yes.
Yes.
Barragan, Luis Barragan. Imagine going to a place like that and you know how everything I had like is black, right? I feel like this ain't my home. I'm not gonna like ruin a Barragan because my ass don't want to deal with the colors, like the pastel colors. It's like, I can't do it.
Yeah, but you know, I can tell you that it's happening every day. I mean, like if you propose a rich space, you get turned down immediately by people.
Yeah.
Well, by usually people more wealthy. And I think it's very much linked to this idea of you know, the purity and the structure of how you're supposed to live. And
Yeah.
I don't know, you said something before, and you were talking about like the intimacy of you know, this difference between the sex act between a heterosexual couple and a queer couple, or multi sort of declination of them. But I think that has its origin also in you know, the sort of purism of the idea of the family as in religions, and like, for example, me growing up Catholic. I mean, the whole problem with queer, it's revolving around this like obsessive idea that the sexual act is a dirty thing, and there is no poetic around it, because but it's not even because it's it seems that there is this tension on the fact that normally heterosexual people grew up with this idea that sex is only good if it's related to procreation. And then all of a sudden, immediately, anything else that is related to pleasure is bad. And so we can extend that to leisure. The concept of leisure and sex are very close to each other. And there is a very big problem there, in which this idea of the queer sex, the act of pleasure, it's very fascinating to me, because it's really related only to the fact that these two people are having fun. But society doesn't want you to have fun. There is a huge amount of guilt that is deployed on top of having fun per se. Like, as a matter of fact, if you don't have a proper job, you're not responding to a societal kind of qualification for living a proper life. And if you decide all of a sudden to have a break in your like working pattern, and maybe finding alternative ways of generating income, well, that's not what you are supposed to do, because you are supposed to have only that kind of sort of type of generating cash. And if you have an occasional job, well, society doesn't see you as someone that is working. And that's absolutely a distortion of it, because work is related to production of labor. And when that act is happening, and and also reproduction, imagine all the work that normally happen in the household, which historically were performed, and still majority of the time are performed by women, of like, I don't know, cleaning the house or doing these things that society wants the women to perform. That's also labor. It's reproduction. It's reproducing the power of labor. And so all those problems are related to this idea of having fun, or simply the moment of leisure. So and like, in a sense, I think at a specific moment, during the sexual revolution and the late 60s and 70s, also white culture tried to appropriate Black queer culture in a way that almost didn't want to develop an identity for it. And for a very long time, Black men and women that were queer and so on were sort of deprived, to me, from that idea of associating themselves as queer. And so generating all that, like, very much ghosted phenomena of people associating sex with like hiding themselves, and the whole story of the peer that was documented by Alvin Baltrop. And I think the whole thing is perpetuated by white supremacy. The fact that Black people had to hide themselves because they were doing something bad, which was revolving around the sexual act, but they were having fun. And I think that, it's interesting to me that the whole conversation that is revolving around Lil Nas X, which is really reframing being queer as a Black man, is just really destabilizing everybody, including white queer people, which are not accepting him as a queer person because he's too queer.
Right. The layers to it, like, even the other day, I reposted one of his clips that he had on his wall, and I literally was blocked. They blocked me, and they did it in such a weird way, and then they're like, oh, you're claiming this as your work. No, I'm not. So they kind of accused me. Right. It was like this whole gaslighting that they were doing. But then when you looking at the conversation around, like, Lil Nas X, and like, as this amazing young, very prolific, like, queer Black artist, and doing such an amazing, like, things. If you really pay attention to some of the things that he's doing, he's not doing anything that's so, I don't want to say revolutionary. There's a lot of things that if you see them in history, these are things that are done, but this is, again, part of that conversation as well. Like, we know what happens to queer bodies as it is in media. And then when you have the Black body that is queer, it becomes a whole other problem where you have to say, well, how do we protect these people? Because I was having this conversation with a friend of mine just before I left. And we were talking about this. They're like, what doesn't make sense is, like, at some point they decided to pick this person, to endorse them, right? And then now this becomes a problem where they're kind of like blocking him at the same time. I said part of it is they thought they could control this person. They really thought they could control the direction that they should take, and their role as, like, is exactly what you're saying. It's like, oh yeah, we accept you as queer and you're doing this work, but then you realize, wait a minute now, like, you're like too Black, too queer, a little too much right now. Now I'm like, but what's too much? Too much for who? This is who they are. Let them be them. And it's like, to go back to the analogy using space, I've used this a number of times. I'm like, people are confused based on how social media is, because they think they have a monopoly to kind of tell you what their opinions are, and they have that freedom because it's like, well, I have a right to blah, blah, blah because it's public. No, just because I'm public, we talk about, okay, when we create and we're designing, there's public spaces, private spaces, right? But understand that a human body is a private space in a public setting when you're outside. That does not give you the right to touch me, to do whatever you want. So there is this misunderstanding people have when they see someone doing work. It's like, no, I am someone who is in the public sphere and I'm doing this work, but who I am, you don't have the right to monopolize, to tell me who I need to be or who I don't need to be. You took me as I was to create the work that I'm creating, and I will continue to create work. And it's not cookie cutter, which is the other problem. This is going back to capitalism. This is going back to like white supremacy or whatever. The cookie cutter becomes a comfort zone for a lot of people. The moment you start adding too many flavors, people think that they could go and say like, well, can I order a taco? I don't want, like, the meat. Does the meat have seasoning in it? Does it have jalapenos? I don't want jalapenos. I don't want this. I don't want that. Did you put sour cream in it? In the end, what you got? A folded pita with shredded lettuce, because you don't want none of the other stuff. You ain't getting the taco. You're not getting the taco. Okay? So at the end of the day, this is what they want. They're like, oh, can we have Lil Nas X? He could be Black, but he can't be too Black. He can be queer, not too queer. Like, oh, can we do this and blah, blah, blah. You're not this ain't McDonald's. You can't have it your way. It can't. And even within McDonald's, you still don't have it your way. How about that?
Yeah.
You don't get to ask, can I get Kobe beef? You can't ask for Kobe beef. They're going to give you whatever beef they're going to give you. They're going to give you whatever chicken product they're going to give you. So you're still not getting what this weird illusion of sort of puppetry, right? So going back to these invisible hands of labor, of like who's directing what, who's manipulating, who needs to have sex and not have sex, what is sex, what is intimacy, pleasure versus procreation mode, all of it gets very intertwined in this sort of like weird ball where now they want to dissect it by creating very specific boxes. And if you don't fit a box, then now you're problematic.
Well, I think the problem is visibility. As long as we don't see the queer bodies, as long as we don't see the Black queer bodies, and that's why there is this intent of constantly, like, you know, framing everything inside the box and put it like, so I can control it. And in the moment that they can control it, and first and foremost, the media, that's becoming a problem. And I think, yeah, I mean, like, it's just the narrative that we have. There is too much of, you know, I see too much Black, I see too much queer, and I think this is happening a little bit, you know, around us in the production, in the cultural production as well. And so I'm wondering, you know, how we can be aware of all this in the light also of, you know, we cannot ignore the fact that we are still in the middle of the pandemic, and a lot of people have been, you know, hit very hard. And, you know, among them, it reminds me of a project that a student of mine at Columbia did last semester, in the fall, which was revolving around a sort of a space for Black and Latinx queer. And at some point it came, you know, very apparent that we didn't know anymore, because so we were sort of reusing, it was a research around queer spaces in Harlem, and then we identify places where Gladys was performing, and all these like queer people in the middle of the century, in the 50s and the 60s and so on. And then her project became a very beautiful project about spaces that could have been occupied by queer bodies, in particular Black and Latinx. And the question then that was brought up by one of the critics that said, isn't it dangerous to show them? Like, do you really want everybody to know that in that space there are Black bodies and queer bodies? And it became this like, you know, what do you mean? Like, is this, you know, what is that all about? Because I think that also society wants to impose this idea that as long as I don't see you, actually, I'm gonna tell you that to protect you, I'm not gonna make you visible because you need to be protected. I think this is a very big, you know, problem in which we have to reshape our relationship with the production of culture as well. It is not true that in order to protect you, you need to become invisible, because otherwise you are perpetuating white supremacy. And I think if anything, you know, what I'm also, you know, been learning in this past year after George Floyd and the fact that in, you know, the Dean of Columbia promoted this sort of a pedagogical agenda of unlearning whiteness. And I think I see that unlearning whiteness into a task for visibility. because I think we need to restructure all these invisible relationship that for a very long time, they've been considered monolithic. And I think I learned this from your wording of this thing, but it's, the fact that in the kitchen, there are so many different flavors that compose the comfort food. It's not true that it's just, the black eyed peas and nothing else, because that's what is apparent to people and it's controllable to people. And I don't know, I think, I not that I lost myself, but I went somewhere else. But I think no, it was very interesting what you just said. But I think what I think is important. Now I remember what I want to say. I wanted to say that this idea of visibility is very, very apparent and strong in your work. And to me, especially if I relate to the show that is on view at the Artists Alliance, until when?
The 14th.
Okay.
Yes, this month, August 14th, in 10 days.
Okay, yeah, because I have to send a couple of friends. But so to me, because of that very strong, presence, like visibility, it becomes also hopeful. Like for some reason, I think that your work is charged with a lot of hope. And I don't know if I'm reading through this, like, even to me, the fact that there is so much production of details in the intertwining of these different fabric, different materials, also materials that are made for a different kind of things, like, the final destination of those products is for, a specific use. And people that will go see the show will understand what I'm saying. But I think the fact that there is so much richness in terms of intertwining details, I think that is so much related to hope. And I'm not sure if this is something that is that you are conscious of it, or I don't know.
I don't, I guess it's interesting. It's such a simple word, hope.
Yeah.
And because you know me, I'm not I'm known to be so real that I come off as pessimistic. And there is a darkness to my work that a lot of people usually have talked about, like, in my past work. And when you do look at this work, depending on who's looking at it and, like, their relationship with me and my work, it does, like, depending on the person, some people like, yes, I see it, like, it makes sense. And some people like, wow, okay, why this direction? I wouldn't say hope was the thing that was, like, maybe not the word that I had in mind, but definitely thinking about, you brought up earlier in your future research and current research around leisure, and, like, discovering how within slavery, the like, giving alcohol to slaves, and, like, the consumption of alcohol, and sort of like the day of rest, which is not really a day of rest within the Haitian culture history. One of the little things that I remembered, which is part of the series, at the core of it, is it Haitians in Haiti around the time of, like, slavery. The day of rest that they were offered, they used that time, because understand, like, we have, like, the residual of the Arawak and, like, Taino, and, like, all these African people who were, like, brought to the country to be enslaved. And then a lot of them died, like, in labor. The earlier people, habitants, like, the Tainos and like, Arawak or whatever on the island. But then that mixture still exists. Plus, you have the different language, the Portuguese language and like French language that gets influenced into that, and their own language that's coming in. Basically, during that time, that's how the Creole language was forged. During that time, they needed to find a way to communicate, and somehow the language of Creole got created as a way for them to be able to be in communication with each other to figure out how do we get out of this fucking situation, right? That's my very flourish way of telling this history. Um, this was something that literally, when I studied it as a kid, and when I say studied, as a kid, information was more a bourrage de crâne, which you're filling your brain. So you're like, la, 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 you're just like, repeating things in this rhythm to repeat it and to regurgitate. But every so often, there would be this bit of information that I thought was very interesting that stayed with me in my core. And that was something that I thought was very interesting and very beautiful, that they were coming together to figure out how do we strategize to get out of the situation. And somehow a language got produced by these people, right? And I felt like I wanted to produce something similar where I was having a discussion with different Black people. And how can I have this conversation with them in a very abstract way for them to say, I see you. Do you see me? I hear you. Can you hear me? And it was a way for me to say, we can do this shit together. Don't stop looking for hierarchy. How do we flatten the hierarchy issue within us, among us, because it's one of the many problems that we have. Colonialism has been pitting us against each other. We have to be in that awareness to not only recognize it, but how do you kind of like counter that to be able to build together despite differences. And once again, a difference doesn't make it a negative thing. So if you look at your economical, like, setup, status, your education or whatever, we certainly can coexist and be able to rebuild together. And how do you do that? This is where the mind was, honestly. And in some ways, to kind of like distill this, and not in a negative way, like I see it as truffle oil, because you don't need a lot. Truffle oil is so intense. To sort of like, distill it to say like, it feels like hopeful. And in some ways, like, I hadn't thought about it. It really is somewhat a project of hope, of love, because it's like there's too much destruction, there's too much separation, and there's too much of like, as we're talking about, oh, this Black love, this blah, 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 it also feels a little fake to me sometimes, depending in the spaces I'm in, where it's like, how much do I trust that you are for Black people, even if you are someone who is Black, things like that. So like very similar to like people who say, oh yeah, I'm for Black women and blah, 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 but you won't date a Black woman. It's layers, right? So it's like really thinking about so much. And it is kind of like this weird, I don't want to use that word, but like it does feel a little bit like, it's all over the place, but it's not. It really is a reflection of the reality of things, the complexity of reality, the complexity of being, and navigating that. So the only way to really kind of like talk about that complexity and to really like go into it and dive into it was to look at, when I start, and this is going back again, and I hate to keep bringing up architecture as like, this sort of thing where it's like, oh, architecture, blah, blah, blah. But it's more like, no, being in architecture, I was so into materiality and like, thinking about because people hated Frank Lloyd Wright so much, Frank Gehry so much when I was in school. I remember Frank Gehry's house, the one that he built, and like that's like so many different materials. And a lot of people hated. I fell in love with that house.
I still love it.
I love it, right? I've never visited it. I want to visit it. But the fact that you had all these, it was this piecemeal of survival, which is grew up to be this sort of like I learned to survive, and everything was is been about surviving and how to survive and how do you move forward to continue to survive. And architecturally, a space like that where you see the mesh can work with the concrete, can work with the wood, and they coexist in their own thing and whatever. And then looking at Black materials where all Blacks, like, you know, fabric are even the same. Like if you get something that's the same, like, you know, a set, you know, it's like you buy it as a set. If you happen to one day wear the top or the bottom individually, you go out and then you try to put them together, you'll notice there's a slight difference between the two Blacks. And it's the same fabric, it's the same material. So just that, being in that awareness, I thought there's something very magical and beautiful to that, because I was like, wow, like, you know, it used to bother me that the things wouldn't match, but I'm like, why are you forcing it to match? It doesn't need to match. It could be its own thing. So this made me think about these different Black people and different cultures and languages and food and how we move and all this beauty, our different hair textures and length and like size and all this stuff. And then just like, how does all of that exist with respect and love, and to move forward, to not let that break. So all of this was very important to me as a thought and a concept, and to try to develop that as much as possible. And then the roles that each of these things play, because that's another thing too. Like like you're saying, like, you know, because some people will recognize certain materials and some people won't recognize certain materials. So you talk recognizing some of the materials where they need to be, their roles as materials. We're not even talking about how I see them and prescribe them in that abstract way, but you have one of the pieces which twinkles. It's such a, I love that piece so much, because it twinkles in such a way. And I didn't even realize it twinkled until, like, you know, I put it up on the wall and moved away and came back in, and the air duct, which was not far from it. See, this is where space is so beautiful, right? And the air duct was moving the fabric that was like curving right in front of it, which is like a very expensive perforated, like, you know, Black faux leather, right? So that Black faux leather was like $40 a yard for that fucking material when I bought it. And then the twinkling Black material that's on top of it is it's a bathroom floor mat, basically, that is, I bought it for like $2-3 locally. So I got the perforated fabric years ago at a fabric store. Meanwhile, the local stuff and, like, you know, like that floor mat was bought locally, and it's like holding structurally. It literally is the structure of the entire piece. You understand that, like, everything else is like hanging from it and at its mercy, and it stands there beautiful and just like in this twinkle as the air hits this thing and it slightly sways, and at the right angle you're seeing this beautiful twinkling that happens. And it just gives me this sense of like, there's a beauty to this in terms of how many people will recognize that it's a floor mat, that it's a bathroom floor mat. How many people will even think about the fact that it's only $2-3 versus, like, you know, the other materials that's like, you know, hanging from it that are very delicate and very expensive or whatever. And it's going back to this sort of like relationship aspect and roles and sort of like flatten this, because they all coexist very beautifully in this I don't know if ecosystem is the right way of putting it, but there's so much that you can think about, or this can evoke basically when I think about it.
Yeah, I think it's also very, very clear when you go and look at the work, but I think it's really a spatial system that you are setting up, and I think that to me it is very, very clear. That is a spatial system, and it does exactly what the Santa Monica house of Frank Gehry does. With all those pieces of life coexisting together, they don't match, they don't need to match. And there are extremely cheap on one side, and then together with something that holds the structure together is clearly more expensive, but it's really, you know, what is the result is that what matters is this synergy among all these pieces that are completely diverse. And I think that's you know, when you mentioned the Frank Gehry house, it reminded me, like, I can clearly see all the pieces of your work because I remember how they're put together. I remember what is soft and what is harder. I remember what is concave and is creating a specific shadows and reveals what's behind. And then it's clear what is more precious. So there is an explosion in terms of aesthetic. Like the pieces are really, really beautiful. But at the same time, I think there are spatial system in which you can see through, and that's when they become these thresholds that is not a two-dimensional surfaces, because all the fabrics are two-dimensional, almost all of them, but they're really not, because they perform a different task on the piece, and they become really this threshold that reveals what's behind, and then ultimately what's behind is the white wall of the gallery, which, you know, really deploy another set of understanding of the art piece that we already talked about it. But I think that the whole aesthetic experience, which I think is very important, it also relates to kind of to your education as an architect. I mean, you've been trained as an architect in school, and I think that that's your device to basically manifest the space. You know, the device that I was trying to made you look for through the Italo Calvino. We go back to the beginning of the conversation. My bringing up Italo Calvino was purely related to engage in a conversation that architecture is beyond the mere, you know, building. And for me, the only way to propose that was engaging something that it doesn't exist, because, you know, the invisible city, they don't exist. It's a pure invention. And I think that ultimately you found your way, you know, your device to manifest all these set of conditions, which are aesthetical, spatial, cultural, racial. I think there is so much richness in that brings back, you know, like this process, you know, that is really present in your early education as an architect, as a you know, we didn't talk about that, but, you know, like, well, we did talk about that, but like, you actually did studio work, and you were critically engaging the studio. And I think that's what brought us together, because, you know, I really had a very specific idea of what architecture is. I still have. So of what architecture is and what it is not. And I think I will always, you know, say what it is and what it is not.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like, you know, it's interesting. Yeah, like, you know, a lot of like my past education, both in Haiti growing up, it's a very analytical, like, education system, like, always analyzing text, context, or whatever, and then going into architecture. That kind of got bled into architecture, and then even how I process in architecture. And yes, like, the concept of what is concept, what is a device, right? And this is something that I learned from you. And I was like, what is a device? What are you talking about, a device? Like, and then sort of like looking at it, it meant that the thing that I thought was weird about me wasn't weird. It was just like something that was undeveloped, and I didn't have language or awareness of it, right?
Yeah.
And then like, and then to recognize that, like, a lot of like my architectural, like, education and like my process of thinking and doing and whatever is still present. I'm really happy to hear that, because you were there in the very beginning with me, and that, and it's something that I thought I didn't want a relationship at some point after architecture school because of how things were and how things ended. I definitely said, like, I'm walking away from this. I didn't want to deal with it. It didn't help that, like, when I did graduate, finally, it was in the middle of the recession. I say in the middle, it was the recession had just started basically at that time. So it was very difficult to try to figure out how do you what do you do when you're so in love with the field, right? Because I was very in love with architecture, and I still actually am, which is apparent from my work, right? And
Yeah.
then to say that I don't want a relationship with this field anymore because of the wounds and all the discrimination and bias and whatever, and certainly the debt, and then to come to a point where, and I have to say, one of the people that I truly am grateful for to be in this place of healing, to go back to a lot of the things that we're saying, this place of healing and recognizing that, I still belong in this field, is Andres. And I met Andres through Zach, who both will be part of the discussion series. And like, he Andres is like, a Black Latino who lives in Chicago, and he's such an amazing human being. And we bonded so quickly, and it was like, wow, like it's interesting that I went through architecture school and I'm finally finding connection with a Black architect now, after post
Mhm.
school, which was very interesting to me, right? And then to be able to have these same conversations I'm having with you and talk to him, who is like, a person of color, and like we're having these discourses and seeing aspects of Black music and sound and whatever, relating all of that. And that got me back to another level of rhythm where I was hiding it. It was also like another thing too, like I was doing things, but I wasn't telling people. So while architecture was still part of it, I wasn't really being vocal to say that, yes, I'm still using architecture. Again, trying to say that I don't have a relationship with it, but that was a lie. But then I started to decide, and this is the beauty of being an artist versus an architect, because I know, while you will fire your clients, I have the ability to say, like, I don't want to do this, I don't want to do that. But the beauty of doing what I do meant that I decide to stay within a space that I am very happy with, which is in the theory of architecture, which is in the diagrammatic space of, like, really trying to understand what are the solutions and possible solutions. Instead of saying a solution, I'm seeing solutions to a set of problems, and I want to be in that space a little bit more, and seeing these as manifestos, seeing them as like more plans and sections and less elevation, because elevation is so surface, right? It's not
Yeah.
that a surface can't be deep, but there's so much a surface, an elevation could do, versus a section and, like, and and a plan. But here's the thing about that. We also know there's the interior exterior architecture and that barrier that can get blurred, right? Where like, you know, the surface can become a space as well. You know, you think about storefront gallery and all these different, like, you know, yes, there's so much that we look at it, and knowing these elements, right? With knowing, like, you know, a Gabian wall is like it's a surface, but then it's a three-dimensional kind of space that is super intricate. All these things are things that stayed in my mind, and saying that, okay, taking these references, taking these very, like, you know, Black aspects of being and existence, and then coming together, how can they come together? So I don't know if I cracked the code. All I know is, like, you know, this is what I feel is a long journey of many discussions and sort of like parables or metaphors or manifestos or solutions through this means and whatever. And that's not even including the sound and whatever. I want to incorporate other elements too into this piece. I want to also include smell. I want to include other senses. I've been thinking about that, because I'm like, how do these other senses, and maybe while I'm here in grad school, I'll be able to kind of like figure that out and explore that a little bit more, because I feel like it needs to be even more complex. And
I really think that your work is deeply entrenched into the field of architecture. So I really think that there is a direct relationship without, I think what's most fascinating to me is the fact that it's so incredibly related to the production of space without making a citation. Like I know many other artists that, you know, have like, I don't know, they get fascinated all of a sudden with geometry, and like I'm okay with that, but I'm saying that your work is very architectural because it's conceptualized that way without necessary resort to geometry. And I agree with you. I think that you know, all the other senses are incredibly architectural as well. The sound is one of the measure of space. You know, we can measure space through sounds, how sounds travel through space, how far it gets, and that's a measure. And I think that also sound is it's a measure of heaviness, because sounds react to the density of materials. So I think that and all this thing comes into my mind because I saw the show, and the materials are of a different density, and I know, you know, how sounds react with the different density of material. So I think it will be very, I'm very curious. I'm looking forward to see what's developed next. Yeah, I mean, like I'm also like really up for this conversation between me and you, and like I think it's very thrilling that, you know, you're in graduate school, but, you know, already, you know, finding yourself finding, you know, like producing you know, a very important body of work, which, you know, I think that you know, going to graduate school in this particular moment is just going to, you know, crystallize certain things and evolve other things, which I think it's a very good spirit. But very much looking forward to this idea of sound and smell.
Yeah, I've been thinking about it a lot, and I was talking to I want to say it was Ayana, one of my art wives. I was saying that even within Black culture, smell is so diverse and intense. Like I love perfume. So anybody who knows me, I love perfume a lot. Like I have so many, like Sephora has, Yeah, Sephora has like a chunk of my money. Like I should buy stock in Sephora, which now I'm thinking about it, I should probably do that. But there's a lot of people who don't like perfume within Black culture who are into the oils, right? And then
Yes,
you have the incense.
of
So,
course.
but I'm not a big fan of incense, right? So then there's and also I'll be in conversation with Michael. Um, Michael loves incense, but I'm a candle person, right? I don't like incense, and he doesn't like candle. So it's like this ace of smell is so interesting within Black culture. And I know that there's one installation I went to see not that long ago. It was like a year or two ago, before the pandemic, when Nari Ward had his solo at the new museum. I don't know if you went to see it. There was one installation room that had, I think it was saltfish, like, you know, it was in cod. And it was, or is it Aki? I can't remember. I'm sorry, Nari. But when you walk in, you could smell the fish in the air. It was just so intense. And it was like, it was so interesting because it brought so many memories going through the market spaces in Haiti. And it just
Yes.
like, it was just like a vivid, like I was walking into my memory. And I don't know how many other people, when they walk in, what their feelings could be, but it's the same thing where it's like, you know, thinking about what the sound is, the distortion of sound, which I want to say in the gallery there's a set of, like, you know, audio pieces that I did, and I want to say this audio piece is at the gallery too, but definitely at the sculpture center that just ended. One of the audio pieces was in an elevator where all you heard was this buoyant sound that was a boom, 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 boom. What it was the sound of two Black people having sex that I extracted from a porn video. And, like, you know, it was a big Black woman with a skinny Black guy, and then you just heard the sound of, like, the sexual, like, intimacy, just like going boom, boom. And then I distorted that even more. But there's an underlying sound the entire time, which was me cooking. Like, so it was like you hear the sound of, like, you know, the pots and me frying something. So all of this becomes like these things that I am in this awareness of what is what is a symbolic, I don't know if it's symbolic, but this, like, you know, archetype sound or smell within culture versus something that gets distorted at some point where you don't recognize it, but it's still part of, like, this existence, which I'm very interested in. So it's like the morphing. It's okay that you don't recognize it at some point anymore.
Yeah.
Like, let's say if I do jerk mac and cheese, it's going to be delicious just because, you know, it might not be part of, like, you know, Caribbean culture, but maybe you recognize the jerk, you recognize mac and cheese, and I made a fusion. Are you not gonna eat it? So um thinking about all these things, right? Um
Yeah, which you know, you made me think, you know, especially this example, and you know, you cooking in the background and the sexual act. It made me think a lot on this idea of domesticity and the sound of domesticity in a context in which you know, the culture and not just the culture. The culture wants the domestic environment of um, uh, African American, Latinx to be morph in a very specific way and disrupt in a very specific way, especially through sound, but sometimes through light as well. Like I'm talking about, you know, the flashlight of the cops that is constantly
yeah.
outside, you know, housing projects, or you know, a specific sound that is disrupt, domestic environment in certain situation, and that derives from the idea of what the domestic environment, what white supremacy wants the domestic environment for an African American family be. And I think that the piece that you're describing is very powerful in that way. That sound distorted is actually a very familiar sound of a moment of intimacy, and there is also you cooking in the background, and of a possible world that sometimes doesn't materialize that way because it's not permitted by society doesn't want to perform that way, and so often even in cinematography the sort of the black sex, the sex around the black body is depicted in a violent way and not like as a moment of intimacy. And I think that that's a very, very powerful thing that you just said. And these days I think a lot about, as part of our research in the office revolves a lot around housing, because there is we are in a crisis. I mean, like we just assisted in the fact that the eviction moratorium expired, and we are still in the middle of the pandemic, and there are a lot of fragile people that could be in a moment in the street. And I think that housing and houses, the very space that is supposed to protect ourselves, is a human right, is something that government cannot remove from our rights to live, and not just a box to be inside, but like a very much dignified space for our life to to have those moments of intimacy as having sex or cooking in the background. So I think that I really hope that the narrative around housing in America will change in the near future. And I hope that architects also will embrace their accountability, because it's not that they're not responsible for gentrification. Because if you're producing housing in a context in which you are producing displacement, you are part of the problem. If you don't want to embrace that accountability, then you have to embrace the fact that you are part of the problem. Or maybe you can be part of that conversation for the change. And I really hope that that could in a sense happen. Like for me, like what you just said, and it's very, very interesting, the idea of this like act of everyday life, like the sex and the cooking.
Yeah, I was, for a very long time, I would record sounds that I thought were very interesting, sounds while you're in the car and there's traffic, and then the car is old, and then like recording that sound, or like I'm very interested sometimes in like wanting to go certain parts of like neighborhoods and just recording the sound in the area, this like this richness of like you hear, especially during the summer, you're gonna hear the sirens, the different types of sirens, the like you hear the motorcycles, you hear the chatter and all these different things, and then that's the public space. And then there's the private space and what that sounds like or whatever. It's such a richness in sort of like the components of being in simultaneity that sort of like is like, you know, is present, but not everyone is in its presence, right? So there's that element to it. But then even within that space of talking about accountability and like, you know, and architects and whatever, I've had many times I would have issues with seeing things or hearing things, or like, you know, I'm like, you know, if you think about it, you kind of need an architectural seal to kind of jumpstart. And I feel like architects are in that space where they can say, you know what, until you have it in this contract, I don't care how much money you have, and it needs to be all architects. It can't be a way for, if you say no, you need to like be in awareness if you're going to be in this neighborhood, or if you're going to erect a building that has like, you know, 200 units and it's all for rich people, a quarter of the units or like 40% of these units need to be for people in this neighborhood. You cannot displace these people and then think that's okay and say that they don't want to be bothered by that, whatever, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't matter. And it needs to be in such a way where the city needs to, like, you know, back those architects, and the architects needs to be firm. Be like, you're not going to get a signature from me unless, you're not going to get a seal, you're not going to get a signature, you're not going to get a design from me unless you abide by this. And then it's not about finding, like, because, you know, sometimes they're like, we'll take the hit, we'll let them say whatever, we'll say yes, and then we'll get fined later. No, it shouldn't be a fine. It should be like, there needs to be laws to sort of protect these people in these neighborhood and these areas to make sure that they follow through with this and not overcharge these people. They cannot be charged the same amount because they do not have that money. And I should not live in filth or squalor because of the fact that these people, they want huge spaces within cities that we kind of like, you know, cleaned up and rebuild. And then we're being pushed out for their pleasure at their leisure, and they get to enjoy our culture that we build in, and then sort of corrupt the culture and trying to do all sorts of stuff. Is very problematic in that in that space. And I'm always like, you know, I guess like you, like, you know, in uproar, having these conversations. I'm like, this is problematic. Like, you know, why do we still have these people who are like, you know, these developers, they're still calling the shot, and it's very problematic. Because there is no real, like, why are we teaching urban planning when there's really no urban planning that's happening? There is none.
Absolutely, you are bringing up a very important point. I mean, like, we're still teaching urban planning, but like, you know, there is no urban planning happening. There are punctual fictional projects that are happening in many, and they're wounding our cities like in multiple places. And that, you can't call that urban planning. Urban planning is not a building, even if it's a large building, it's not urban planning. There is no planning there. There is no system in place to understand the urban fabric in the context and how that relates to a larger context of the city. There's nothing. I mean, like, it's you know, especially in the reality of New York, but in general in America, you know, they go in with a developer and they can, you know, basically do whatever they want for purely for the sake of, you know, the capital investment and the return of the capital. I think that, you know, there are certain things that society needs to accept that also we don't live like, you know, the beginning of the 20th century, and the family is not a patriarchal family or necessarily a man and a woman with kids, or like, I think we live in a world in which architecture must respond to the new condition of living, and also normalizing people that live as single, like, you know, like, it's that's the new kind of client we have to design for. And I think, you know, when I brought up single, because like that doesn't mean that a single person lives in a studio or in a compacted space. Like that's not what we are designing for. And I think that there are, you know, policies that must be in place for this to change.
No, I think policies, ways of thinking, all of it. Then there's like, you know, just because someone can't afford there's affordability as well, because it's like, you know, let's say you have certain rents that are in the 500 bracket, which should happen. That shouldn't mean that I'm living in a place that's smaller than a shoebox either.
Yeah.
So there's also these other elements to it that just like, it gets really complicated in ways where I'm like, who's calling the shot? All this whole idea of like, real estate in space is like a measurement of like square footage per dollar, per this, per that, whatever. And I'm like, who made these rules, you know? And then you have different groups of people have different needs. I've had these conversations before. I've been in spaces where I was like, you know, group discussion, or there's like, you know, charrette that's happening around these like things like, oh, what do you guys need and whatever, and blah, 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 and whatever. And I'm like, look, you can't say you're trying to design spaces within a community that is a high community of like, you know, creative people, artists. They don't have that money to have a studio and a home. You're asking for too much. You need to be able to have live workspace, design live workspace. It's not that it can't happen. This is going back to this fucking capitalistic fucking bullshit and this like way of like, you know, creating more problems. Because if you say, oh, well, based on the regs and whatever, no, don't give me that shit. There's plenty of ways to design a building that is sustainable, that has space, that can be live workspace for different types of work. Because I've also had people say, well, oh, well, you know, then there are artists who work and does toxic stuff. That's why we have proper venting system or whatever. So don't give me that bullshit either. It can be done. You know, you can create it so if you know that there are people who will be working very heavy and like you know, it needs better ventilation, those could be the lower levels of like, you know, the building or whatever. And then the top level could be like, you know, a different types of like, you know, artist work or whatever. We don't need to like say that it can't happen because of X, Y, and Z. I think that's very problematic. It also means that you yourself, you have the money and the capabilities to sustain both, when most people don't have that ability. So I think there's so many layers in that problem. But then to go back to this idea of like, you know, urban planning that doesn't exist or whatever, I think it's another capitalistic thing. Like, you know, you still are generating these people, you're giving this education out for something that is clearly not happening in our society. Where are these people who are allowing for urban planning to happen? Because it can't just happen in one building, it can't just happen on one block. You need to really think about what's happening in this area. What are you offering? What are the good nutrition values that you're offering these people? What is the education that's being offered? How close is like, you know, the education? What is the care in that neighborhood? It's funny that we're having this conversation because my last project with you was designing a city. So it's really funny that I'm going into this, because that's what I had to do. I had to really think about, okay, what happens in the year 2030, 2050, if the ice cap melts, and then like, you know, one of the places that will be affected the most would be New York, you know, would be underwater. And how do you kind of like, you know, redesign that? And thinking about how those neighborhoods would be in peril, into sort of like creating these tower communities I literally was thinking like, okay, if each tower can't be like, oh, this is just a building of like apartments. No, if we're making the neighborhoods vertical, then we need to really think about the neighborhoods. Like, what are the needs? That means security. This means health. This means education. This means jobs. You need all these things to sort of like, make it work. And that's what they're technically trying to do, but that doesn't happen in the end.
Oh, absolutely. You are absolutely right. And I think that there are elements of, for me, like there are four pillars of, commoning, and, which is accessibility to housing, accessibility to health, accessibility to education, and accessibility to food. And I think you cannot remove these four pillars from the idea of designing a city for, for the future, and especially with this idea of sharing. I don't think, especially thinking about the American suburbia and the detached house, which is such an expenditure of surfaces in terms of land, in which perhaps just one family lives there and so on. I think that we need to come to terms into the fact that we will live sharing, and you have to poke your bubble and learn to love the diversity among people. Look at the richness of and how like enriching is the experience with a person that is really different from you, and racially, culturally, and so on. And I think we need to embrace that type of relationship among each other and learn how to live that way, because architecture is also producing a lot of problems in terms of the consumption of the environment and so on. And I think that one of the solutions is really to live together. And we need to find a way how to live together, which by chance is the title of this year Biennale in Venice, but whatever, I didn't say it for that, it just came into my mind.
No. Coexisting and living together is, and this is even someone like myself who I tend to seclude myself a lot, but the thought the other day, I was thinking, even if going back to sort of like, what does it mean to be single and to have a home, and you could live properly based on your like, economical means, but then thinking of your neighbors being your cohorts, the people that in your like, part of your professional field. Like, I've thought about this, like these are visions I've had for like years anyway, in terms of thinking about, I still design spaces in my head, and they're very much community spaces. I think about like, especially when I see like, very old spread out factories that no longer exist, and how those can, instead of demolishing them, how they can be like, renovated and be like, amazing live work spaces for artists, and like, be able to have not only like, live work spaces, you could have like galleries and all sorts of stuff that in that area, but it then is an enriched community in some ways, where everyone sort of knows each other and can care for each other. And even if you're single, you're not necessarily alone and secluded. You could have a meal together if you choose to, or whatever. Just the simplicity of these things. But then it goes back to this idea of like money. You have to get like, you know, paid what you're worth sometimes. And if you're gonna, and that's another whole other conversation, right? Because even the pieces that I've made sort of like, you know, confuses you in ways where you're like, do you know what is what and what is worth what? Because it sort of like plays with that same thing where it's like, can society look at spaces where you, instead of saying, well, this area is the poor neighborhood versus this is the very rich neighborhood, but why can't neighborhoods just be neighborhoods in a way where like we just responsible and like, you know, we have our spaces, and these spaces, the like multi-separated spaces, very similar to like how this work is created. Because I think about a lot of these things, it's not just the individuality and the traits and the characters about an individual and the complexities of that. It's not just about thinking about the quasi-urban planning of what could be and what might have been if this didn't happen, and what this and what that, but it also is like, you know, the possibilities of like coexisting, and the coexisting in different economical situation, different sort of lifestyle, different like preferences and whatever, and we can do this, you know, very
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that more than society, I think that this is what capitalism is producing. I mean, like the separation of like the classification, this is how redlining came into place, you know, the classification of neighborhoods based on the quality, the so-called quality that, you know, was directly proportional to the amount of African American livings in those. But that was also, you know, a real estate scam. I mean, like all the, for example, the, you know, our research on the urban voids, certain urban voids where, like, for example, an example for that everybody knows, like the Bronx is burning. The Bronx is burning. It was a real estate scam. Like it was done on purpose to create a moment of like really, you know, a depression of this, like, you know, pieces of land and vacant building and so on. But in reality, it was done in a way that the developer could have bought those places at a lower price and then reconfigured them for like 10 times the cost, the cost for the newly occupant.
Right.
So I think, you know, this was happening in the 80s, but production of urban voice are still happening in the city. You can see that, for example, you see this like, oh, that amazing building that has been vacant for 4 years. Why has it been vacant? Well, it's designed that way. It's because everything around of that will go lower in price. And when they decide to redevelop the property, they develop that property and everything around because they will have the possibility to buy. So I think that, you know, those schemes are, you know, just not just society, but it's designed by capitalism. And
yeah, no, for sure. And we see them all the time. We see those spaces. I remember thinking, like, you know, even before Newark started to get, years ago, I was like, I find it very strange. You have all these perfectly fine buildings and they're just sitting here vacant. And it's not just Newark, but I mentioned Newark because, like, you know, I was around Newark more often. But any one of us, if we have a conversation, we know the neighborhood we're in, being Bronx, be it Brooklyn, be it like, you know, in Harlem or wherever, like, you know, in Jersey, wherever we are, like I'm sure like places down south or whatever, there's always these like areas where you're like, these are perfectly fine spaces that could be inhabited by people like at a cost that they can afford to live. But instead, they're sitting on these properties purposely waiting for the right time for them to swoop in right? In order for them to do what they want to do. And I think that's criminal. Like that's a level of criminal act where it's like it's so well calculated, where I'm like, why would you deprive groups of people that could benefit from living in these spaces comfortably, okay, even if it's for a limited time, if the temporary, even if it's 10, 15 years, that's still 10, 15 years for someone to be able to build their lives in a space, as opposed to like, you know, being in a space where they're very uncomfortable or they're living in very like, you know, poor situations, like, you know, or they're like, you know, couch surfing, like, you know, and stuff like that. And it's such a, you showed me a detail of a rope that I made with a contractor bag, a piece of leather, and something else. And thinking about when I see rope, which more a lot of times whenever people see rope in my work, they're like, oh, I get it, it's about slavery, it's about blah blah blah. And sometimes it's about that, but sometimes it's about something else. And I think about the structure of a rope when you cut it and you look at the section and kind of fray it and pull it apart. It's so many different strands that get woven together in different groupings to kind of make that. And you think about some of the things that happens in our society. I can't not think about the structure of a rope because it's never just one element. There's so many things at play that is not meant for you to see. You know what I'm saying? And it goes back to, again, when I think about, and I mentioned this earlier, this idea of like you walk into a room, someone might look at a room and say, I'm going to paint this wall and da da da, and that's all they see. Meanwhile, I'm thinking about what's behind the wall and like, you know, what the wood is, the structure, what's underneath the floorboard, because at some point they become these invisible structures, invisible hands that you're not meant to see that is still at play. And,
Absolutely.
and all these things, I think about them, and as hard they are to like, you know, for me to explain sometimes and really want people to think about, it's like, how do I tell people think about this without saying, go think about this? Because I don't want to instruct someone to do this. I really want you to analyze that a rope is not just a rope. It's not tied to like, you know, this sort of like history of death, but there is another history of maker and craft that's part of it as well. But then there's another sort of abstract metaphor to it as well, as to the intricacies of society, and or even intricacies of some of the things that we see like capitalism at play, and how that works, and how all these things you can kind of like understand it through just looking at a rope and the structure of a rope. And not all rope are made the same, so that's a whole other element as well. So I it I feel like we, like, you know, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, that's amazing. I think I don't know. I mean, like as I said, I think these conversations are fundamental for, you know, our imagination and intellectual advancement. I think that I'm enjoying it very much because it's just really feeding each other with things, and then you go on a tangent one way, but then I think, oh, but that's also about that, and
Right.
and I think that's really good.
Well, on that note, all I'll say is to be continued.
To be continued. Yeah, I think we didn't get to 7.5 hours like James Baldwin
No, we
and
didn't.
Margaret, but I think we did pretty well because you know
I
we
think
are.
so too. I think
Yeah,
so
yeah,
too.
no, we did very, very well. I mean, like it's 9:15, so it's 2 hours and 45.
Right. That's
Yeah,
not too bad. No, no. We'll
no,
see. We'll see how long the others will take, but like,
yeah,
but I guess for part one on rack one
yeah,
rice without rice, we're doing good. And
yeah, absolutely.
we'll just stop here and then we'll keep talking some other time. And thank you.
Yes,
Orsini.
please. No, thank you. And yeah, as I said, please let's continue this informal conversation even throughout this time. And I'll
Yeah.
come up to Yale. Let's do
Yes.
that.
Yes, you definitely come through, come through, come through. All right, on that note, thank you, Artists Alliance, and thank you for anyone who's watching. Part one is 3 more to come of Rap on Race Without Rice.
All right. Thank you.